Now I'd like to talk about decimals. First, if I would like to place a list of decimals in order, the easiest way to do it is to put them on top of one another and compare the place values from left to right. So, let's say for example I have the numbers 0.535, 0.536, 0.52, 0.5351. Now the first thing I'm going to do is make sure each one has the equal number of place values. So I can add zeros as placeholders to make sure each one has an equal number. So here, I notice the greatest ones have 4, so this one only has 3. I'm going to add a 0. This one only has 2 after the decimal, so I'm going to add 2 more zeros. So I'm going to start with the first place, which is 0. Notice they are all zeros, so they are equal in that sense. I go to the 10th place. Notice they are all 5, so they are still equal. I go to the 100th place. I have 3, 3, 2, 3. So this number is going to be my smallest. So I'm going to, since there are 4, I'm going to write a number 4 here. I'm going to go to the 1000th place. I have a 5, I have a 6, I have a 0, and I have a 5. Already eliminated this one. This one has a 6, therefore it is greater than both of the other ones. This is going to be the greatest of all, so I'm going to put number 1 next to that one. So we have 2 left to compare. They both have 5 in the 1000th place, so I'm going to go 1 more place. This one has a 0, this one has a 1. So this one is going to be greater, so that's going to be number 2, number 3, and number 4. That is how you compare decimals. Place them on top of one another, make sure the decimal points are lined up, and then compare from left to right and see which one is bigger in each place. Now, if I'm adding or subtracting decimals, it is very simple. The basic rule for adding or subtracting decimals is I have to make sure my decimals are lined up. So say for example, I have 23 plus 2.5. I'm going to place them on top of one another when I add them. So 23 plus 2.5. Now first I have to figure out, since the decimal for 23 is not written in, I know the decimal is going to be after the last digit right here. So remember I'm going to line up the decimals, so I'm going to place the 2 below the 3 so the decimals will be lined up. Then I'm going to place a 5 here. Now, notice if I would like, I can place a placeholder here, 23.0. 0 plus 5 is 5. I drop down the decimal, exactly where it is. 3 plus 2 is 5. 2 plus 0 is 2. So I have 25.5. If I want to subtract decimals, I do the exact same process. So let's say I have 23 minus 2.5. So again, 23 does not have a decimal. I'm going to place it right there after the last digit. I'm going to add a placeholder 0, subtract 2, making sure my decimals are lined up, 0.5. Now I got a carry, so I'm going to write 10, take 1 from here, 10 minus 5 is 5, drop down the decimal, 2 minus 2 is 0, 2 minus 0 is 2, so I have 20.5. So for adding and subtracting decimals, the key thing to remember is to make sure your decimals are lined up. Then you can add any zeros as placeholders after the decimal if needed. When multiplying decimals, you do not need to line up the decimals. In fact, you can ignore the decimals when you multiply, and then you simply count how many decimal places were in the numbers you were multiplying, and then add those at the end. So let's take, for example, 2.5 times 0.03. I'm going to ignore the decimals, so I'm going to write 25 times, since these zeros are simply placeholders, I'm going to ignore those zeros and simply multiply times 3. 5 times 3 is 15, carry the 1, 6 plus 1 is 7. 75. Now I go back to my original problem and I count how many decimal places were in all of my original factors. This one has 2 decimal places, this one has 3 decimal places, so I'm going to move the decimal over 1, 2, 3. Notice I'm going to need a placeholder 0, so my answer would be 0.075. So when multiplying decimals, simply ignore the decimals, multiply normally, and then at the end, count up how many decimals you had in your factors and add those to your final answer. Dividing decimals is a little bit different. So let's say, for example, I have 2.5 divided by 0.5. When I have a decimal on the outside, I must make it a whole number, so I'm going to move it over until it becomes a whole number. I move this over once. That makes it 5. But if I move this decimal, I have to move this decimal the same number of places. I move this over once. That makes it 25. 5 goes into 2, 0 times. 5 goes into 25, 5 times. There is no remainder. So my answer, moving the decimal straight up, would be simply 5. I can always check my answer by multiplying back with my original numbers. 5 times 0.5. 5 times 5 is 25. I have 1 decimal, 2.5. That was my original, so that is correct. So that is how you divide decimals. Make sure the outside number is a whole number. If it is not, move the decimal over until it becomes a whole number. However many times you move it on the outside, make sure you move it the same number of times on the inside. You're going to move your decimal straight up and then divide normally.